Hello, everybody, and welcome to Police and the Press, what you need to know about news coverage of protests. I'm Kathy Brister, president of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, and we are pleased to present today's training event in partnership with the Society of Professional Journalists, the Georgia chapter, the Georgia Public Safety Training Center, and the UGA School of Law First Amendment Clinic. As always, we want to thank GFAF sponsors whose generous support makes it possible for us to offer free training events like this one. We could not do the foundation's important work without them. Now let me tell you a little bit about today's panelists. Jasmina Alston is a reporter for CBS 46 in Atlanta. She previously was a multimedia journalist in Birmingham and a political reporter in Dothan, Alabama, covering local and state politics. She's a Georgia State University grad and is happy to be back in Atlanta. Clare Norins is the inaugural director of the UGA School of Law's First Amendment Clinic, which provides law students with real-world experience and serves as a resource on First Amendment issues. She's a member of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation's Board of Directors. Chad Wilson leads basic training for the Georgia Public Safety Training Center. He has been a law enforcement officer for numerous agencies, including the Georgia State Patrol and Wilcox County Sheriff's Office, where he served as chief investigator. Chad was very involved in developing the center's use of force instructor course and serves as the center's public information officer. Our moderator today is Charlotte Norsworthy, past president of SPJ Georgia. She is content editor for the Outlaw Ocean Project, a nonprofit journalism organization that chronicles human rights and environmental abuses on the high seas. She's also a journalism instructor at UGA. We would not be here today without the great work Charlotte, Ashlyn Webb, and others at SPJ Georgia did to help the Public Safety Training Center develop a media training course for officers. That training is the starting point for our conversation today, so thank you to the SPJ team. We encourage you to put questions in the Q&A throughout the discussion. Our panelists will answer as many questions as time allows toward the end of our program. Now I turn it over to Charlotte to kick off the discussion. Charlotte, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kathy, and thank you to our panelists. Really excited for the discussion that we have outlined today. Before we get started, I just want to start off with what's new and the origin of this program and this training and how it came to be. SPJ Georgia is an advocacy group that seeks to be proactive on issues that affect journalists within our state and then, of course, within the United States as a whole. And so the idea for this training came to me and Ashlyn, who's here in the chat maybe. She was my counterpart very much so in developing this program. It came sort of in response to a lot of violence and use of force and just overall sort of chaos relating to the George Floyd protests. And there was a lot of confusion that came out of that time back in May 2020 as to journalists' rights, police rights, and sort of where is the line, where are the boundaries. And we just felt like it would have been a very great resource to develop this training, not only for law enforcement officials, which was sort of where our partnership with the Georgia Public Safety Training Center came to be, but also to extend this training out to the public, to journalists, and just sort of, continue our efforts with spreading awareness on this issue. So it was a long process, just about a year in the making, but we're so excited to be here today and so grateful for the partnerships that we've established in this process to be able to produce a more productive conversation on these issues. So to go ahead and jump right into it, I'd love to first start with a question for Chad. Can you tell us a little bit about the Georgia Public Safety Training Center? Who goes through training there?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, I'd like to say thank you so much for allowing us to be involved in this. We've really enjoyed our partnership with you so far and look forward to working with you in the future. So the Georgia Public Safety Training Center is located in Forsyth, Georgia. It was established in 1987 by Governor Zell Miller, and its purpose is to train first responders and public safety officials throughout the state. So we cater primarily to law enforcement, but we also do firefighter training, EMS training, E911 training, in addition to housing many of the state agencies' training units here. So the Georgia State Patrol, Georgia Bureau of Investigation, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Juvenile Justice, and Department of Community Supervision also all have offices here on campus, and so we help facilitate their training as well. And our training ranges everything from basic mandate training all the way through any advanced and specialized certification that officers may want to receive.
So Chad, why did the center want to engage, with us, with SPJ Georgia, to develop this media training program?
Well, we thought it important for, not only for law enforcement in the state to understand that the media has a job to do in addition to the job that we have to do, but we think sometimes there's a vast misunderstanding between the media and the police, and sometimes even a distrust between the media and the police. And so we felt it important by partnering with you to initiate this training that maybe we could break down some of those walls and barriers and realize that we have a common goal. Our goal as law enforcement is to protect the public and to ensure public safety. Whereas your job in journalism is to report to the public and let them know what law enforcement agencies in the state are doing. And if we can work together, I think it completes a much more broader picture for the public as opposed to us trying to work against each other.
I totally agree. Thank you. Claire, hello. Let's reflect back a little bit. What did last year's protests tell us about our overall understanding of the news media's rights to report and law enforcement's rights to keep the peace?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me today. And I just want to applaud SPJ and also the Georgia Public Safety Training Center for the work that you all have done together. I just think that's an amazing, groundbreaking step for Georgia to be taking. So since last May, with the murder of George Floyd and the galvanized nationwide protests that resulted, there were multiple troubling interactions around the country between police and journalists that sparked a wave of litigation seeking to protect the right to observe and record. So we saw in Minneapolis and Portland and LA and New York and Chicago, just to name a few locations, lawsuits arising out of police having arrested and used force against journalists who were covering protests or other civic discourse events. And we also saw courts reacting in some cases by enjoining the police from arresting journalists or using excessive force against them or confiscating or deleting their work product. And we also saw a number of situations where journalists of color were subjected to arrest while their white counterparts were not. And one high profile example of that was CNN correspondent Omar Jimenez in Minneapolis, but there have been other instances as well. So I think what that showed us overall is what Chad was mentioning, that there's really a need to educate on both sides, both law enforcement and journalists, about the respective rights and limitations on each side. And so for journalists, they serve this really essential role in our society to be the eyes and ears of the public. And to do that, they need access to be able to observe and record and report about demonstrations and interactions between civilians and law enforcement. And under the Fourth Amendment and First Amendment, they cannot be arrested or subjected to use of force simply for being present or for taking pictures or video or for taking notes. At the same time, law enforcement has a very important job to do in terms of maintaining public order and safety. And that means that journalists are going to have to follow the same rules that other civilians have to follow, meaning that they can't interfere with the police activity, they can't trespass, they're going to have to comply with orders to disperse in most cases unless there's been some prearranged communication between the journalists and the police to allow them to remain. So we just see a real need for both parties to kind of have a mutual understanding of the rules of engagement. And then another big takeaway from this past year has just been the sort of emerging and not quite new, but it's been highlighted this year in terms of how do we distinguish between who is the media, who is the press, and who isn't. And so we often have seen a disparate treatment by law enforcement towards institutional press, meaning journalists who are working for a recognized corporate media company, versus freelance or independent journalists who may not have all the visual trappings of a network reporter or a network photographer. And so under the First Amendment, the rights of a CNN reporter are coextensive with the rights of a freelancer, right? They're treated the same under the law. But what winds up happening a lot of times in the field is that the police will default to respecting the rights of the corporate journalist, but not necessarily the freelancer. And so I think we've seen a real need for clearer policies and guidelines of law enforcement agencies, but also a need to make those policies and guidelines publicly available so that journalists know ahead of time sort of what are the rules of the game before they're actually out on the street trying to report and having no clarity about what their rights are. So I think it's really important to both have those policies and guidelines in place and also make them accessible and available so people know what they are.
Thank you, Claire. And speaking of being on the streets, Jasmina, hello. You were on the ground covering these protests in Atlanta last summer. What stood out to you about the interactions among police and the press, and then the public as well?
Yeah, so first I want to start by saying thanks so much for having me. Just from my experience last summer, the interactions between police and the press, it really varied during the protests last summer, and it depended on the atmosphere at the time. And I do want to say that covering the protests last summer was such a huge learning lesson for me because it was the first time that I covered protests of this magnitude. So it was a huge learning experience. But some examples would be for the interactions. There were times when my crew and I would follow along with the police officers. We would be walking with them. We would be standing behind them. But then there were, of course, also times when we were walking with the protesters and, on the other side. So that affected those interactions a lot. It was actually very interesting. If we were walking or standing with the police officers, it was a lot easier for them to tell us, what was coming next, to tell us their game plan. Or we would overhear, hey, there's about to be tear gas, or we're about to start dispersing people. So that communication was a lot better, and it was a lot easier for us when we were on that side. But on the other hand, when we were walking with the protesters, a lot of times we would have to say, hey, wait, we're the press. I'm a journalist. And there were times when we were pushed back and that communication was lost. But again, that was most often when we were walking with the protesters. And of course, there was a lot of quick thinking that was involved, I think, on all sides. Everything was moving so quickly, and you just really have to be on your toes the entire time just to know what's going to happen next and where should I be. But from my experience overall, the interactions with the police officers were not terrible. But I do think, like you all have mentioned, the communication, sometimes got lost in those moments because there was a lot going on.
And when you were in the field in those moments, did you feel like you were prepared to defend your rights as a journalist?
Honestly, going into the protest coverage, I thought I was completely prepared. I thought I knew exactly how to defend my rights as a working journalist. But in those moments, I realized maybe I'm not as prepared as I should be, just because everything is moving so quickly. And to the point that was made earlier, the difference between being with a station like CBS 46 or CNN, and then watching some of the freelance journalists, there was a difference in how they were treated. And I noticed that a lot of the freelance journalists did have to be a lot more vocal and say, hey, I am a journalist, I'm working here. So that was very interesting to see as well. But I will say, I definitely had to go back and really reevaluate after those first couple of nights, because I thought I was more prepared than I was.
You mentioned, I'll just quickly mention here, you mentioned the difference between the freelance reporters versus the corporately represented reporters.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of where SPJ's initial response stemmed from was in support of the freelance community during this time, because our former president, Haston Willis, was detained live on the air on CBS, hilariously enough, and was a freelance reporter reporting for the Washington Post at the time, and was, a huge misunderstanding and miscommunication, but that is a very real concern and something that has been showcased even in Atlanta in the last year. So Chad, I'd love to ask you the same question, but from the law enforcement perspective. Many of the recent protests have been focused on police actions, which makes these protests different from, for example, protests against war or COVID closures. So what has the effect been on police officers on the job during these protests?
Well, as you mentioned, this is quite the different situation that we've seen. Traditionally, the police role in any kind of protest or demonstration has been to kind of contain and protect, and the protesters' attention has been really elsewhere. Whereas, under the current conditions, the actual protests are directed at the police officers, who still have that role of containing and protecting, the protesters as they're out there. And so I think one of the big things for the police officer is it's so different now for them, because in the past, they were just seen as maybe, someone on the periphery that just happened to be there. Whereas now they are the actual, a lot of times the focus of the ire of the crowd, if you will. And so, they are feeling, I hate to say it, they feel attacked a lot of the times. They feel like they're trying to be instigated. A lot of the protesters, and I'm not saying all, but a lot of the protesters are getting in the faces of the officers and actually trying to instigate some type of confrontation. And that is completely different than what we've seen in the past. And so with the officers and also with what they've seen on the nightly news, I mean, you turn on any news station anywhere in the country at 6 o'clock, and, it's something bad about the police that you see on TV. So a lot of the officers are feeling that they're being, held to an unrealistic standard, or they're being painted with such a broad brush that the actions of a few have affected the feelings that the public really has against all police officers. So that is a real change in the way we're feeling. I happen to be old enough to have been working during 9/11 and immediately after 9/11. And, the support that the law enforcement first responder community got after that incident was overwhelming. And so over the past 20 years, we've seen almost a complete 180 in the view of the police and in the public's eye. And so I would say that's probably the biggest change. But the biggest thing that, that the police officers have to remember, and something that we stress when we teach, is the protection of that First Amendment right and the protection of the Fourth Amendment. We certainly understand as we go out and do our job of protecting people during these protests that, 260 some odd years ago, thousands of people died to give you that right to be able to go out there and protest in a free country. And that is a sacred right. And we have to understand as the police that, whether you're media or you're a protester, as long as you are peacefully assembling and you're voicing your concern, that as much as we may or may not like your message, our main job is to ensure that you maintain that right to do that.
And so, in the past year, what kinds of questions, or has the center received any of these types of questions? Has police departments reached out asking, or even individual officers asking about this press coverage that you mentioned and free speech rights and how to sort of manage that?
Well, we've had general inquiries, nothing absolutely specific. It's not like, Atlanta PD has called and said, hey, what do we need to do with the media? Of course, agencies like that are generally large enough that they're going to come up with their own policy procedure of how to deal with the media. So what we try to do is give general guidelines in all the classes that we teach, whether it be criminal procedure or any of our media relations classes. And again, we just try to focus on those constitutional rights that are given us, and make sure that the officers really understand, what that interaction between the journalist and the police should be.
Thank you, Chad. Claire, coming over to you now. The First Amendment Clinic has developed resources for journalists in covering these protests. So briefly, can you describe what are the key takeaways from those resources for our audience here?
Sure. So, going back to this issue of how do you identify yourself as press, I think, it's important to have as many visible markers as you can, whether that's your employer issued press ID, or even if you make yourself a badge that says press, or have press, written on a cap or a shirt, something that's just immediately visible to identify you, even from a distance, is important. Also, if you have business cards or other, sort of documents that you can show to police if they question you, are you really a journalist? I think is helpful to be able to produce. And keeping in mind that if you have those verifications on your phone, that sometimes if you are being detained or arrested, you may not have your phone or have access to your phone. So it's better to have something on your person, you know, paper, cards, that sort of thing. It is important to be mindful that, as I mentioned earlier, you know, as a journalist, you still have to comply with police orders to, you know, stay on the sidewalk or disperse or what have you, unless they've specifically given you an exemption from that order. You also want to be sure to document everything that's going on, you know, even as you're being questioned by police or stopped by police. If you can continue to record or have a companion who's with you continuing to record or taking notes, if not able to, you know, video or audio record, that can be very important evidence after the fact if you are arrested and need to challenge your arrest. You also want to be careful not to voluntarily disclose your work product. So that means not showing any of your notes, not showing any photos or video that you've taken. As a journalist, you do have a qualified privilege to protect that information. And if you voluntarily show even part of it, like one photo, some courts have held that that's a waiver of your rights to all of your work product, and therefore the police have the right to see the rest of your photos too. So you want to be very careful not to voluntarily waive that qualified privilege. If you are being searched, or, you know, if police are looking at your notes and photos without consent, you want to be very vocal and say, I'm not consenting. You don't want to physically resist, because that could put you in danger of harm, but you want to be very vocal and just, you know, repeatedly say, I do not consent to this. And then finally, you know, it's important not to physically resist just because you don't want to be injured or cause someone else to be injured. If you're going to be arrested, then you're going to have to challenge the arrest after the fact. So you do want to make sure that you yourself notify or have a friend notify as soon as possible, a lawyer or your editor or someone who can know where you are and know which law enforcement agency has taken you into custody, because that will be very helpful in hopefully shortening the time that you remain detained or arrested. So those are some of the main takeaways. I encourage you to look at the full document that I believe was put into the chat for other tips on how to prepare and how to respond.
Thanks, Claire. Okay, a two-part question here for our journalist and for our law enforcement representative, starting first with Jasmina. So clearly, you know, these protests were back into protest season, if you will, and protests specifically about police actions are continuing. So what would you like police to understand about your job while you're out there covering these protests?
I think the number one thing that I would love for those in law enforcement to understand is that we're just doing our job, and our job is important too. I know last summer during the protests, there were times where I was actually told that I was intentionally trying to make the police department or police officers look bad, and that's not the case at all. I'm doing my job. So I think just that understanding, and this is a good way to start, you know, that conversation, having Chad here and just, you know, talking through and being able to understand that, hey, we're doing our job and you're doing our job. How can we do that together and do it at the same time without there being any issues? So that would be the number one thing that I'd say is just, hey, we're doing our job. It's not that we're coming out here to make any one person or any one group look bad, or that we're looking for something bad to happen.
Thank you. And Chad, again, similar question, but from the police perspective, what would law enforcement like members of the press and the public to understand about their job in the midst of these protests?
Right. Well, I'm going to steal Jasmina's answer because it's basically, please understand that we're doing a job. You know, we're out there. The only reason we're out there is because people are protesting. So that they have caused us to have to be out there. And the main mission, you know, during those protests is to protect property, to protect people. And again, you know, I hate to keep harping on it, but really at the end of the day, to protect that right to be able to peacefully assemble. But as far as journalists go, the one thing I would really like to stress is, you know, law enforcement appreciates the fact that journalists are out there, at least in my opinion. I think that a professional law enforcement officer should appreciate the fact that we have media on scene. And it goes back to just like when we first started putting cameras in cars and when people started wearing body cameras. if you're doing your job the way you're supposed to do your job in the right way, you shouldn't care how many cameras are on you or who's filming you or who's taking pictures. So at the end of the day, I know, at least from an administrative standpoint or from a supervisor standpoint, and also from a public standpoint, I appreciate the media being out there because it can show that police officers are doing the job the way they're supposed to do it. On the vice versa, if police officers are messing things up, that needs to be documented, and those people need to be held accountable as well. But I think another thing that I would like journalists to know in general is, as long as the journalist does not interfere with the police action, there really shouldn't be that much confrontation between journalists and police officers in one of these situations. Now, that's not to say it doesn't happen. I know sometimes police officers instigate that when they see a camera. I also understand that there are journalists, and generally you see it more, again, from the freelance than you do from the corporate journalists. But they almost won't seem like they are trying to instigate things sometimes, and it can create a tension between the journalist and the police officer. So just understand, we want to protect your right to document and to capture the news. At the same time, understand that if that assembly becomes unlawful, it's declared an unlawful assembly, or it becomes violent in some way, the police are going to act. And at the end of the day, please just, whatever news gathering you're trying to do so in a way that you're not interfering or confronting the police in the performance of their job. And I think if we understand, like Jasmina said, that both of us are out there doing our job, we can have a mutual respect for each other, and we can both accomplish our jobs without having conflict. And I think at the end of the day, that's what we're all after.
Great, thank you, Chad. So I'm going to move into a final question that I'll have for all of the panelists. But before I do, just want to go ahead and flag to our attendees to go ahead and be typing out your questions in the Q&A for us, and we'll have a few minutes here at the end to address some of those questions. But first, maybe we'll start with Claire. What are your final recommendations here on what and how law enforcement and journalists can do to work together with each other to avoid conflict during protests?
Well, first, I think just recognizing that there's maybe an issue that needs to be addressed is a good first step. And so for reporters who cover a certain geographic area, I think it's important to try to start those conversations with your local law enforcement agencies if they don't already have pretty clear media policies in place, and to establish a relationship. We're all human, right? We react better when we're dealing with someone that we have somewhat of a history with or a trust with. And so trying to build those bridges and open up lines of communication long before you're actually out trying to cover an event, because in the heat of the moment, it's going to be really hard to negotiate or to come to agreement if people are viewing things from different angles. So I think taking those proactive steps in advance is really important. And as I mentioned before, making sure that any policies or guidelines that are adopted are just really accessible to everyone, so that there's no mystery about sort of the rules of engagement.
Great, thank you. Jasmina, what are your recommendations?
I would agree with Claire as far as establishing that relationship and making sure that, going into, the protest coverage or the protests in general, sort of what your game plan is, and also understanding where the local police departments are coming from. And to Chad's point, I would also recommend, as far as journalists, yes, we are doing our job, but there were times during the protest coverage when we were walking with the police officers, or we were standing with them, and I could hear one of them sort of yell over, like, hey, you're a little too close, like back up a little bit. So just sort of respecting that space too, and listening, and, paying attention to where you're reporting from and where you're standing, because you also don't want, to get yourself hurt or put yourself into a bad situation because you want to get right next to the SWAT truck that's, going down the street. So that was my experience, where I was too close, and one of the officers said, hey, you really need to back up a little bit. So to Chad's point, just, being aware of what's going on and listening, and, just paying attention to your surroundings and being prepared ahead of what you're doing, because everything is happening so quickly that sometimes it's hard to come up with the best solution in that moment.
Thank you. Chad, any final thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a great start. The partnership that we have formed and the training that we're working on, having discussions like this, I think is a great start. Just like anything else, training and education always make things better. And to Clare and Jasmina's point, if you can form a relationship with your local agency, or if you can form a relationship, at least with most agencies have a PIO, at least go ahead and form that relationship. If you know there's going to be a protest and you know that you're going to be out there, go ahead and call the agency and notify them. Let them know that you're going to be on scene and that you're going to be, documenting what's going on. But familiarity always is a good thing. If you can go ahead and build those relationships prior to, I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think at the end of the day, both sides need to realize that, on the other side of that camera and on the other side of that shield, there's a human being standing there that has feelings that, at the end of the day, you want to do your job as a journalist, or you want to do your job as a police officer, and you want to go back home. And that's pretty much, if you can boil it down to just the humanity of the people that you're dealing with, I think it would make all those interactions, go a little bit smoother. And so I think education goes a long way with that. So I think this is a great start.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to move into some audience questions here. We'll first start with a question for you, Clare. What is the situation for government issued media passes in Georgia? A reporter in our audience says police often only will recognize General Assembly issued press passes. What's your take?
So the law does not require you to have a press pass to be able to observe and record. I think press passes come into play in part where a journalist is asking to do something that a member of the general public would not be allowed to do, such as to enter a restricted access area or to remain on scene, when there's been a dispersal order given. And so while not all police agencies will recognize sort of informal press badges, it's important to understand that you still have a First Amendment right to be present, to observe, to record, whether you're a journalist or a citizen, and you don't need the press pass for that right.
Great, thank you, Clare. A question here for Chad. How would law enforcement treat journalists who follow protesters into areas or situations in which law enforcement has blocked? So the attendee here is thinking of protesters who proceed into highways, for example.
Okay, at that point, you have exceeded your First Amendment right because you've entered into a restricted area. You are in fact breaking the law at that point. Your First Amendment right protects you in all public areas and any areas that you have been granted access. So if you have not received permission from the police department to be where you are, if it's a restricted area, then you are at that point no different than the protesters in the fact that you're breaking the law to be where you are.
Great, thank you. So maybe this is a question here for Clare, and then maybe if Chad, if you have thoughts too. What should journalists know about trespassing? In what ways are journalists likely to have problems around trespassing?
So again, going back to the idea that journalists aren't exempt from generally applicable laws. If you're a journalist and you are entering into private property without consent, or government property that is restricted access without consent, you can be subject to arrest, and it would be a lawful arrest. So while you are free to observe and record anything that you can see, like while you're standing on public access property, if you can see into private property, you can still observe that and maybe take a photo or video of it. But you can't actually go and cross that line and get into the private property. So, and then another thing for journalists to be aware of is that if you're standing on the sidewalk and you can see into someone's bedroom, there's an expectation of privacy, right, in someone's bedroom, particularly if they have curtains or blinds. And so there is a tort called invasion of privacy that journalists can be subject to if they are sort of intruding beyond what would be reasonable, even if they're standing on public access property while doing so. And so that's a tort that journalists should keep in mind, that can sometimes be raised if they've captured an intimate moment that someone expected to be private that was happening in their private space.
Great. A question here for Jasmina. As a working journalist, what would you like to see next to bring journalists and police together to prevent future conflict during protests?
Pretty much what we've been saying, building a better relationship. And I know a lot of times now, if we're anticipating a protest of any kind, we'll reach out to the police departments and say, hey, what are you guys doing in preparation for this? Because I definitely think that helps. And I understand that, we can't know every detail of what a police department is planning on doing, because obviously we can't know all of those details. But I think it helps to sort of build that relationship and just to say, hey, this is what we plan on doing. This might be a good spot for you guys to set up. This is where we're going to be. This is where we're expecting the biggest crowds. And I think moving forward, doing that will make a huge difference, because last summer, from my experience, I think everyone was just not expecting what happened. And I think that caused a lot of confusion. So definitely building those relationships, having more conversations between journalists and police departments will make a huge, huge difference, and building good relationships.
I just have a follow-up on that, because that got me thinking, you're often taught, and your editors are often encouraging you as a journalist to be visible in the community, right? And I wonder what's your thoughts on how COVID has maybe impacted the ability to be visible and to be present in the community in order to be a familiar face when situations like this of civil unrest sort of come to the forefront.
COVID's definitely made it more challenging as far as getting out in the community and really being seen. But I will say that it hasn't necessarily been an excuse to not build those relationships. Zooms, for example, what we're doing here now is a great way to get that conversation going and to have more people be involved in it, because it's so easy to hop on the computer and keep that going. So just because you can't physically see someone or physically meet with someone, don't let that kill a relationship, really keep that going.
Great, thank you. Okay, Chad, I have a two-parter here for you. So first, can you tell us about the use of force training that the center is working on?
Absolutely. So currently we have probably 4 or 5 classes on the books just dealing with use of force de-escalation in and of itself. And so some of the new initiatives, and when I say new, please understand that in the training business, we try so hard not to have knee-jerk reactions to current events, because so often you can't let court of public opinion drive your training. You need to look at science, what are emerging trends, things like that. So currently here at the center, we have developed a use of force instructor course, which focuses primarily on constitutional law, statutory law, and case law. We teach very heavy on our Fourth Amendment, Graham v. Connor, Scott v. Harris. We teach Georgia statute. And so the class is really built around that, a really in-depth understanding of the legal authority and what police officers can and cannot do. And then also to go along with that, we do tons of scenario-based training. And so within the use of force instructor class, we actually spend a whole week on actually how to come up with training objectives, script scenario-based training, and run scenario-based training so that you do achieve that training objective. We also have a class called Tactical Diffusion Strategies, which is, don't let the name tactical fool you. It's really a really good de-escalation class. And we have a little different take on de-escalation here at the center. We think of it as an outcome as opposed to a process. And so that's a 3-day class where we teach officers to pick up on verbal and nonverbal cues from people. Not every situation can be de-escalated, but through verbalization and conversation, we try to get them to pick up on if the situation is going to be able to be de-escalated. And then we also have smaller classes, that we offer online and in person as well. So we have a pretty good array of use of force and de-escalation training on our catalog.
Great. And then as the part 2 here, what should journalists do if they want to learn more information about the center and then the current trainings that you have for police?
Okay, I believe the link for the center has been put up. Also, my contact info will be put up or put out later. If anyone has any interest in coming to the center and seeing what we're doing, we are very transparent, and we try to honor every media request that we get. Understand that training does not go on every day. So if you're wanting to come see that particular training, you know, if you got a news story to do at 5 and you call it noon and we're not doing that training that day, we're not going to be able to help you. But you know, if that's something that you want to do in advance, just contact me or contact our executive office, and we will be more than happy to try to set something up for you to come down.
Fantastic. Great. Well, I think that wraps up all of the current questions we have here in the chat. I just want to thank all of the panelists here. This has been a fantastic conversation and one that I'm super excited for personally, just with all of the efforts that we've been doing in the past year. I think this is a great start, as the panelists have said today. I also want to thank all the attendees for attending today's conversation. If you registered for today's event, you're going to receive a follow-up email with the link to the video that's being recorded now and some other resources. But otherwise, thanks everyone. Hope you enjoyed this lunch hour with us. Have a great rest of your week.